Hey, good morning. Welcome to Wake Up and Ship More. I am your host, Joe from DevHub. And today we got a fun episode. I'm just looking for my marker. Here it is. Today we're going to talk about a few different things that I think are really critical to kind of pull together a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about on previous episodes. Some of the things that we've been discussing around building your app and architecture and stuff like that have been really important. We're going to talk a little bit about pulling some of that stuff together. And this episode is called Devil in the Details. And the reason why is because we're going to talk about some of those details that go into actually shipping code and why it's more than just pushing code. But before we get started, a few housekeeping things. Scrolling at the bottom of the screen right now, if you have not already signed up for the newsletter from DevHub, I suggest that you sign up for it. We have tons of great information there that is really well put together every single week with what's happening in the developer ecosystem, what events are coming up, changes, things that you should be aware of. Definitely check that out. We also, if you are not aware, let's Redacted Bangkok. That is the big in-person event, but leading up to that as well is a 8-week hackathon. It's going to be massive. There's going to be tons of stuff around that, that from both this show, from the DevHub Live, from all our different social channels. We're going to have a lot going on that will help you be successful in that hackathon. So if you're interested in doing that, it's a great opportunity. Over $500,000 worth of prizes throughout that. Definitely check that out. Redactedbangkok.ai is the web address. Couple other things too, if you are looking to kind of get started, whether it's through finding different communities, whether it's looking for documentation, things like that, you can start here at neardevhub.org and get started from there. So let's jump in. Oh, one last thing actually here before I even forgot. If you are watching this on a replay, if you are not watching this actually live, there's a Telegram group you can join. You can come in, you can join the conversation and ask questions there as well. You can also reach out to me on Twitter. My handle is there under my name. You can reach out at any time and ask questions there as well. We also encourage questions during the show as well. So feel free to jump into all of that. So let's talk a little bit about actually shipping code and like what we're actually talking about when we talk about, what it means to send something to production. And there's some things here that I think are both maybe more complex than people always consider, especially if you've never really shipped anything of any kind of scale. And secondarily, I think there are things that are small and minor maybe feeling, but are actually really important. So I want to address all those different pieces of that today and kind of pull some of what we've been talking about over the past few weeks all kind of together in getting something to production. So let's kind of just jump right into it, 'cause I think that's probably the easiest way to talk about this. So one of the things here is that you need to understand like what you're shipping and what it means to actually deploy your product. And what I mean by that is fairly simple. So basically, if you have an app and it includes, again, so I have an app and I have my website, okay? And maybe I also have a mobile app, right? So I have something in mobile, and then I have a back end, right? So I know I got to ship these different components here. So like, what does that mean to actually go and ship all of this? And so that's a piece that I do think is worth really trying to talk through and understand what goes into all of that. So within the setup, you're likely going to have some kind of architecture. And we've talked about architecture in some previous episodes. Yeah, I definitely think it's worth checking out some of those if you haven't seen them before. And when you think about what your architecture is, like that's going to determine how you actually deploy something. So if I have a architecture setup of, let's say a dozen microservices, well, then my deployment process, and I don't want to get into the details of like, continuous integration and like what the actual DevOps of this is. We're talking more in the planning and strategic pieces of this and like how you think this through. So we can do DevOps a different day. Um, but it's important. So I need to understand, like, okay, do I have microservices? Do I have a monolith? Like, what actual code base is actually getting shipped out? And so my code base here, usually again on my back end, is going to be one of the first things that has to get shipped. And I need to also think about too of like what other services are connected to this. And so, and this is where things start to get a little bit complicated, right? So I'm especially when we're dealing with stuff on blockchain, but even in Web 2, like you're going to have your test environment, right? You maybe have your staging environment, and then you're going to have your production. These variables that are there for your environment are going to likely be different. So there's some things there that you need to be aware of. And so you need to make sure that you're really listing this all out to be clear of what's going on there. So the challenge that becomes, though, is as you get further along and as you're ready to go to production, and let's say you have an app that is now past the MVP stage. So we're saying we've done our MVP, we've validated our idea, we are ready to actually go to production and get this in the hands of as many people as possible. Well, I've had to have made some decisions of like what my structure is and what technologies are maybe like what third parties I'm using. And so all of that is in my initial deployment. It's important to then understand of like, what does it mean to deploy also with some of those third party services as well. So sometimes that might affect it. But what happens is a lot of times is you're so focused on like my launch date, right? So like everyone's caught up in like this first part of my launch date that you forget that sure, I have a launch date, but then I'm going to have to maintain this. And now once it's live, like software's never really done, right? So if it's never really done, then I need to think a little bit more through that a little bit of like, okay, then what does my maintenance start to look like? How do I start to maintain what I've now shipped? And that's kind of the part two. So like if this is the part one, I'm considering like, what does this look like? What is the structure going to be here? Part two would then be, how do I maintain all of this? So now I need to understand, like, did I plan well enough that this code base and this architecture is not unwieldy to then maintain? There are a lot of different opinions about, again, things like monolith versus microservices and everything else like that. That's a separate discussion. And I think there is no perfect answer for a lot of that. But what I can say is that you need to be comfortable with whatever decision you have chosen. And you need to know what it means to update your code. And that's where the whole theme of this episode is the devil's in the details here. So the details of like, what does that mean for me to go in and make a significant change in the code base that maybe, could affect my users, could cause downtime, whatever that might be. So those are things you have to start to think about. You also need to be able to understand, we'll call this part 3, is like, how am I going to know that everything is okay and everything is going to not just work the way it's supposed to work, but also like as it starts to grow, as more users come on board, that they're all having the proper and most likely the same experience. Okay, so we'll call this like, how robust is your app? That's a decent word for that. So now I have to consider like, and how do I know? And so this is where I talked about in a previous episode about like, you need to have logging in your setup in some form that is descriptive enough to you as the developer. Again, whether that's you being a team or you being a solo dev or whatever that might be, like that feedback that you're getting in that logging has to be meaningful to you. someone should be able to say to you, this function didn't work right, or I feel like, I faced some kind of error or negative situation. I should be able to know where to look to see and understand what maybe happened. Now, not always you can figure everything from the logs, and sometimes you have to be able to recreate the issue and actually see it happen. Fine, I totally get that. But you need to have enough information, enough logging for that stuff. You also need to be able to understand too of like where your scaling is, right? So as things start to grow a little bit, where does that all come together? So that's that part. Now, the piece here, and this is kind of tied into, again, our launch and our maintenance and everything else, but this is really a part of the details that I think, again, are often overlooked. So, and this is where I want to make sure that when you are looking at what your code base is, I always try to draw it with not just like my backend infrastructure, and like my APIs and like talking everything else. Like, what's my front end look like? What is the end user actually interacting with? And in this case, maybe a website and a mobile app. And so if those are the two things that they're actually interacting with, then I need to be considerate of that. But my details here is where you win your user. And I'll give the example that I gave before in another episode here, but where UX can really make a difference. So if you're building in Web3 and you're working on a crypto project, you sometimes run into the issue of obviously time, right? So some chains are fast, but you still sometimes have these delays, and you are beholden sometimes to other infra that is outside of your main infra, like RPCs and indexers and everything else. And maybe you're running your own, and that's its own issues and everything else. So you sometimes, though, want to mask as much as that to your end user. You shouldn't make your user wait just because you have to wait on the back end. So what can you do to make that experience better for the end user, where they don't feel like they're constantly just waiting for things to happen? And that's where UI and UX comes in. That's where the little details of like what happens, like what does my loading screen look like? What are the indicators letting the user know that everything is okay, that something was successful, something was not successful? Does my interface provide something clear enough that that if something does go wrong, they know how to reach out and get support, and they're not just instantly put off. A great example is so the old Diablo error. I think it was like error 30. I would say yes, error 37. That's what it was. Okay, so back, this is now, over 10 years old or so now, longer. So in Diablo 2 or 3, so there was an error that would come up called error 37, and that's what all would show to the user. The user would see this error and they wouldn't know what was going on. Error 37 was related to logging in, and it was an authentication error. And the problem would be is that the error had no descriptor. The end user had no idea what was really actually happening when that error came up. And so they would just keep trying to log in. They were like, I can't get to my game. I can't log in. And so just keep hitting it. Well, if you scale that and you think of all these users who don't know that the error is actually an authentication error, they don't really know that it's a login error, and they're all getting this, and they keep trying to log in over and over and over again, then you kind of come into this thing of like, now you're like DDoSing yourself just because there's not good user experience for your end user. So like, this is where I think it's like just, your details here have to really be carefully thought out. It's not just about, again, having a cool looking interface. It's like, is it actually functioning in a way that like is providing experience to your user that makes sense? And when your end user has an issue, they can either react appropriately or better provide you that information, or whatever that might be. And you don't want to have that error 37 issue. Okay. part of the details here, again, when we talk about like, again, I need to consider all the details of my app, right? So I thought about, how do I launch it? How do I maintain it? How robust is it? How is it going to scale? Do I know what's happening with it? My user interface. So the next piece here really is about like performance. Okay, and this kind of ties into robustness, but I'm gonna give it its own category, because it's not necessarily just tied to scaling. This could be just even on launch and day one. So, do I know my approximate load times? Do I know like when a load time is abnormal? Do I know when, how fast a transaction should happen? Like, what is an acceptable window? And how do I then handle an incident that is outside of my window? And that's where I again, the details here are super important, because if I don't know, or I don't know what to expect from my performance, I have no way of judging it. I have no way of knowing if I'm being successful or not. So we really want to be careful that like our performance is a big piece of this, of like, again, how are we staying focused on the end user experience and knowing that where I need to make changes. We also need to know like what goes into this. Okay. And so this is going to be a few different things. It's going to be your infra. Okay. It's going to be your code. Okay. It could also be, though, a little bit of, again, like your UI, UX. So performance might simply just be like, yeah, my code maybe is clean and efficient and my infra is good enough. But like if the user experience is poor, where like I don't know where to click, I don't know that I'm supposed to do the next action. Well, now the performance actually is gone down due to like your user just getting stuck. Like, and so now like they're like, oh, you're in your mind, you're like, oh, this task should take 5 seconds to do on my site, but now it's taken 20, 30 seconds. Well, if it's not these first two, maybe it's the user experience, right? Maybe it's that interface is not clear. And so that time that's being used up is actually just time that is like the user fumbling around trying to find how to do the next thing. So something just to consider of like what really goes into your performance. Now, there are some more like minor details that you can get into that I think kind of tie into some of your performance and some of your robustness. And a little bit of that is like, you know, uh, let's say like what's my auth setup? You know, what can I do in the background? You know, and that's a really big piece too, of like how much can I abstract away from the end user and just have things happen for them. So, and again, like these are little details that maybe are not, don't seem so meaningful at first, but as you start to think about, again, like that whole full experience, right, this whole thing here, like maybe that like pushing some more stuff to the background or happen later is maybe more important. Again, like the pulling in data, right? So if you're showing like any charts, so this is always a good one here, of like if you're showing analytics charts of any kind, and you don't necessarily need to have real-time data. It's silly to pull data in real time still, because if it's not as meaningful to the end user to be truly real time, you're better off having some kind of mechanism that is fetching it at a certain interval in the background. And so that when they go to that analytics page, it's instantly loading with data for them to see, and then maybe updates subsequently after that. Versus like, I'm going to bring you to that page and we're going to now load for the next 30 seconds to a minute, pulling in all this data and then making the charts. Like that's that's the stuff that is, again, it could be maybe minor when you just think it through or you talk it through. And yes, there's maybe a lot more coding that has to go on the back end, but that stuff, again, those details are what start to make the difference of your product. And it also changes, again, for the end user of like, what are they focused on? Where are they going to give you the best feedback? If the feedback is constantly like, oh, the load times are so long, well, now you're scrambling to figure out load times. And like the number one thing that people do when they say hear load times is like, let me beef up my hardware. It's like, let me get the bigger server, more memory, the faster internet connection. It's like, okay, maybe that's the issue. But like the first bet usually actually is probably like your code. So maybe can you clean that up, make that more efficient? And second, again, is that user experience. So this is that detail again of like, can you focus on that and understand how you can improve your user experience through these little pieces of mechanisms. So again, when we talk about devil in detail, that's what we're talking about here. Okay. Now, we want to be cognizant of, I guess, modern software development. And for that, this is where I would say, like, I mentioned it at the top here, but external services. Okay. This is a really important detail that you need to almost be like hyper vigilant against, because it is so easy to let this stuff slip. But what I mean by that is, so I have a product and I use a handful of external services inside my product. If I don't know exactly how they work, how much extra code is it going to bring in? How much dependencies am I going to now have on this? Is it going to affect other things that I have in there? Do I understand what gets affected? It's just like, when you talk to your doctor and they're like, they prescribe you one medicine. They say, okay, you're going to take this medicine. Don't have this other medicine because they'll interact. Well, it's the same thing possibly when you have all these third parties of like, hey, if you're going to use this third party, don't use this other third party because they're going to interact. They're going to cause a problem. And you need to be able to really be clear about that. So many times when I've just like even like casually consulted, not even coming in formally, just giving feedback. They say, I'm stuck here. I don't know what's going on. It's like, oh, you could look at the third party libraries and you can point to there and you see, oh yeah, like this one is causing an error here. This one's dependencies are off. And now you've just caused this mess. So your external services is a place where you really want to be detail oriented. You also want to make sure as well that you are really on top of like when they make changes. Because now as soon as you introduce a third party, you are beholden to their changes and their code. And so yes, like you can essentially like lock a code out from auto updating, and you can do those type of things, and but you have to be cognizant of that. Like you have to plan for that. All these things have to happen as part of your planning and then execution of your product and actually shipping to production. So that's where, again, and also I will say you have to be careful too, because sometimes like in the test library, things feel maybe very fast because there's nobody on the test network, or maybe things feel fast because, it doesn't matter. You're running it locally. So there's nothing else hampering. There's no other, right? You're not worried about like concurrent users and things like that. But then all of a sudden you ship to production and now you have a problem. So you really have to take time with those third parties and really go through them carefully. You also want to make sure that, again, anything in your backend that then has to interact with that, do those APIs match up? Have you taken the time to go through all of that? Stuff like that. Lastly, I think on this part here that to me makes the most sense is just making sure that, and this isn't even like the actual act of shipping, but I just want to include this because I think this is important. And I will say, coming from spending time in a corporate environment, like a very corporate environment, like enterprise, like big enterprise, this doesn't happen too often. Of like, you as the developer need to keep learning. And this does not mean I'm going to keep trying new things. I'm going to shove all this stuff and all the like the hot, cool new thing into my product. I'm not saying that, but it's important that you keep learning and staying on top of stuff because you want to be able to better adapt when it's time to adapt. Hopefully, you're adapting before it's too late. You want to make sure you're ahead of the curve. You want to make sure that you're following what are potentially best practices, or maybe best practices have changed over time. And so you want to be clear on like, hey, like, am I still doing the right thing with all of that? Uh, a thing that's come up, I know even for myself before, is that, if you're working in, let's say, mobile, right? Like if you're not learning and you're not staying up to date because of how quickly and how often the operating system will change from year to year, and maybe will include breaking changes. Like you have to be on your toes constantly, all about that. So that's where, to me, I really want to make sure that like you are considering like learning and you're staying on top of stuff, and that's part of your detailed oriented process of like, hey, now I'm going to go ship, my product because um, I feel comfortable of all these different parts of it. Okay. So that's the first part of when we say like here are the details and what are we focusing on. And this is a big transition. We just talked about here 7 categories of stuff, with some subcategories here that all go into essentially shipping a product. Where before, when you were just building, you're just like, code in, code out, and like, here's maybe my architecture, and here's, my back end, my front end, and, yeah, this is a lot of work, and it's a lot of code, and a lot of planning. But like, this is like all the stuff that really goes into it. And, when you get to a really big team, sure, there's gonna be different groups that are handling different parts of this. Like, you might have a DevOps team, you might have a testing team, and you may have maybe have like a really big team. You might have like a team that's handling just like authentication. You're gonna have like designers and everything else. But the teams that I've seen be successful, and the teams that I've seen, or this even the small teams that have been really successful, have been around those who can understand the stack as best as possible. No one expects you to be an expert in all of these things. Like that's not realistic. So like I do not fancy myself as a designer. I don't think I am particularly great at UI UX. That's not what I am. But I know enough to one, have a conversation about stuff and understand when a designer is telling me and giving me different feedback. I know also enough to be able to then like recognize something that could be blatantly problematic. And so in my thing, that hopefully I don't have to wait for a designer to do that. And so that becomes part of that. So hopefully you are minimizing some of that, being reliant on all these different smaller pieces. But you also need to be able to know, like, even if you're not in DevOps, if you are just the developer, right? You're just like, let's say the lead developer, even like a mid-level developer, like, how do you launch this? Like, you should know, even if you are not authorized to do it, okay, you don't have the privileges to sign off on it, you should know, how do I launch my code? How do I ship an update? At what point are we going to hit limits against, like our scaling and everything else? Uh, what are the things, how does my app actually work? What can I push to the background? How does the authorization actually work? All things like this. What kind of infra is being used? I should know all of these things as a developer. And if you are on a small team and you are segregating your self even in a small team, you're making a huge mistake. And again, I don't want to confuse you where you're saying like, if you're a small team, let's say 5 people, okay, and you have a DevOps guy who's like, he or she's doing DevOps, and that's his or her job, that's great. Like that's an awesome position to be in, because that is a can be a very challenging position. But I would expect anyone on my team who is just maybe a developer, right? So your job is to code and ship code, take tickets and take stories and ship and push updates and everything else like that, I would still expect you to understand, like, again, how things get deployed. I don't need you to be skilled enough to do the deployment. I don't need you to be trained in DevOps, but you should know enough of, like, here is how something gets shipped. And the answer also can't be like, hey, send it over to, Samantha, she's going to go ship it. No, it can't be like that either. It needs to be enough, like, what's happening. So the other part of this too is then, like, again, you should be able to troubleshoot your own app from top to bottom as well. And this is a must for a small team. So again, if you are a team of even just, again, 2 or 3, and let's say one of your 2 or 3 is an intern or a junior developer, someone who's inexperienced, like, I would encourage you as the then more senior developer to bring that person along and make sure they know how to fully troubleshoot the app and be able to go through all these different parts of it and understand it at the bare minimum. They don't have to be able to do something about it, but they need to be able to understand it. And I think you'll see a lot more success come out of there by doing that. Now, why do we say we have to focus on the details? The reason why is because, again, when you are shipping your product, if you are not crazy about, especially here, we'll start here first. We'll call this like section 1. Okay, like this first group. This will be group 1. Okay. If you're not like, just, a professional level, like paranoid, like going through your process of like, did I like do everything right? Do I have everything set up? Have I put myself in a position to be successful if something goes wrong still? Like, then, like, you're just rolling the dice. Like, you're just gambling at that point. It is worth it every time to spend the extra time, even if it takes you an extra few days, even if it's an extra week, to know that you have really mastered what a launch looks like and what a maintenance piece looks like. That's just group 1. Like, that's the bare minimum. And if you can do that, you're at least on the right track. Because I promise you, you're going to ship to production, and then you're going to have to make an update fairly soon after. That's just like typically how things end up going. Even if you think you've got everything right, something comes up. And it could be minor. Hopefully it's minor. Could be a little bit bigger. You need to know from day one very clearly how this is going to work and be comfortable knowing that this is going to be an efficient process. Because again, like, it's not just about knowing it, it's about understanding it and believing that it is going to be an efficient process. Okay. The next part here, I would say, is, we can group, I would say, these 3 things here. This would be my group 2. Okay. I want to take that a step further, and I really want to dig into, again, like, do I understand how robust everything has to be? Do I understand my user experience, performance, things like that? And then my group 3 is here. And the reason why group 3 is kind of on its own is because, look, I understand when you're trying to ship, especially if you, again, are smaller, like, you have limited time, often, to really dig super deep into your third-party stuff. You are likely going off of either previous experience, feedback from people that you trust, or maybe just reviews online or whatever you find to trust in, like, this external code. I don't love that approach, but I understand it's not always realistic. So I put it in group 3 because these are, they're not necessarily nice to have. I do think they're important. They're more than a nice to have, but they don't have to be truly on day one, especially if you're a smaller team and you just don't have the resources to really address all of this right away. Like, if you have to kind of push some of this off a little bit, That's fine. If you, though, completely ignore these two things and you don't dig into the details of how all your external stuff is going to loop in, how it connects, all that stuff, you're doing yourself an enormous disservice. Like you're asking for trouble down the road. And then same thing with like the learning piece. Without the learning piece, next thing you know, you're 10 years into a product and you have, legacy code and technical debt that just at that point is like never going to get fixed. And now the only way it gets fixed is like to do a major overhaul, which introduces a million other complexities and everything else like that. So that's the major piece of when we say like, hey, are you digging into the details of how you actually deploy something? If you actually get the code shipped, are we doing that? The other part that I think is really relevant to the conversation, and I think this is a good exercise that goes in with like just understanding, like, am I thinking through the details well enough? And I hope if you're watching, most of these episodes, you're picking up on a theme that like a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about is all about like, are you taking the time to really think through what you're doing? What are your processes to consider what is the right or wrong decision, right or wrong path? What is your thought process? It really, it can't be just by like your gut in software. You have to have some justification, because at some point, even if you're a solo dev, unless like your product is just going to just die on the vine and you're just going to let it go and run its course, somebody might have to come in at some point and do that. Or even yourself are going to have to come in and try to update something or fix something way down the road, where pretty much it might as well have been somebody else who wrote it, because it is unrecognizable to you. And if you have not taken the time to put all those details in place and really been thoughtful about your decision making, you're setting yourself up for failure down the road. You are taking shortcuts early on that will lead to much larger issues down the road. So a trick that I learned a few years back is, and this was from actually another group of developers who had a podcast who were talking about, how do they make decisions around the defaults in their app. And defaults are things like the settings that you would allow somebody who's using your app, your product, to change. So it could be like, turning on notifications. Do I get emails? Dark mode, light mode. If let's say you have like an audio player, like the default speed, how do I load data? Is it by is it by date? Is it by alphabetical? Whatever it might be. And so maybe these are all different choices that maybe you give a user, maybe you don't. And so they talked a lot about, like, first off, like, what choices do I actually want to give the user? Which I think is a great exercise. Like, it's a great thing of, like, when you're thinking about the features in your app of, like how much do I want to really let my user customize? And there's a lot of stuff that we can go into maybe on, like, a different episode of, like, some of the psychology around all of that. But the choices makes a difference of, like, what I'm actually going to give choices about. Secondarily, then it becomes of, like, what is the default setting of those choices? Okay. So the most basic one is like light mode, dark mode, right? What is the default? So nowadays, I would say most time the default is like whatever your operating system is set to. So if your operating system is set to like light or dark mode, the default is usually one or the other. So that's usually how that's solved. And if you were to then make a decision outside of that, and you were to say, well, yeah, we're not going to look at their operating system value. We're going to decide for them. And then they can go back and change. They can change it on their own later. So we're going to put everybody in dark mode regardless. Well, okay. That's again, it's just light or dark mode, so it's maybe not like a huge thing. But now, like, you have made a decision for the user that is possibly outside of what their expectations are. So what does that mean? How did that affect how they use the app? Things like that. Again, like just all the stuff. Like let's use the example of like a profile, right? What data I share, how I go through all this stuff. What are all of those defaults? Like privacy is a big one, right? So yeah, there's some laws in different parts of the world that dictate some of that, but there's not it's not always comprehensive, and some places don't always have it. And so you, as the product owner, need to decide like what are the defaults and like what does this look like? Can the user change these defaults? So for example, again, if you've ever shipped a mobile app, you now have to fill out on both iOS and Android a form stating like the different privacy choices and things like that. And one of the questions actually is like, does the user have a choice to like opt in or opt out of certain data? And you can say no. You say no, they don't have a choice. Like, this is what's happening, and then just gets reported as such. The challenge there obviously is like, if the user doesn't like that choice, they may not use your app, which is there again, it might be okay. But like you have now eliminated that from their choosing. And so that the lack of choice becomes a choice. So all of these things here, all of your defaults are things that you should carefully think through. And this is again tying all of this stuff together of like when I want to be really conscious of the details of how I ship a product, the details of how I maintain my product. The exercise of, this is the tip of the day really here, is do the exercise of like, what are my defaults? What am I allowing my users to actually choose to turn on and off? Like how much choice do I give them? What are the choices they are allowed to have? And then like, where do they start? So anything that does have a choice, what is the default choice? So if they don't go in and change anything, what's the experience that they have? And you doing this exercise is like really meaningful long term, because it hopefully helps you recognize, one, like the actual user experience they're going to have, but two, of like, it should force you to explain your decision making. And as I said in previous episodes, like that is the number one thing that can help your productivity, is like talking through like, why am I making this choice? Because I think you're going to learn a lot about yourself and your timing and where you put your effort the more you talk it through. So the defaultness of like making default choices and doing this as an exercise is just a huge piece of that. A couple of quick things around here before we wrap up. So if you have a small team, this is a great collaboration exercise. Okay. You break this down, you give it to each team member, you let them go through it and let them justify it, and let them talk it through of why they believe certain things should be set up a certain way. Okay. In theory, the way you set up your defaults, okay, should be geared towards what I would consider a faster onboarding. Okay. Because you never want a purposely slow onboarding for users. You want your users in and using the app as fast as possible. You don't want them making a million choices. So the faster they can onboard, right? So this is an important piece. This is an important piece. These two things right off the bat. My team's going to collab better, and I'm going to get my users in here faster because I've gone through this exercise. I know what defaults they should have set for them, things like that. And now all of this stuff really hopefully pulls together, your thought process of like what your app actually is, and like, have you shipped it in a way that makes sense? Because again, this exercise, if you think it through, it's going to address certainly some things here. And now you hopefully as a team have talked through and learned group one. Group two actually does get a boost a little bit if you do this, like, team exercise. Okay. And so now you have a really hopefully thoughtful and detailed out experience. So I just, and we'll continue to talk about some of this stuff. I do really hope that, you're starting to get a sense of there's so much more planning and consideration that goes into actually shipping product than just writing code. It's writing code is such a small part in all of this. It's an important piece. You have to write good code. You have to be able to do, your product has to work the way it's supposed to work. That comes down to like the code that you write. But to actually ship a product, okay, and then, again, what we're focused here on productization and getting things out the door and getting things in your users' hands, you have to be considerate of all these little details and really take the time to do all of that planning. So that's going to win more battles for you in the long run by taking that time before you go live, as you go live, and then after you go live, because that is going to define, again, your product all the way through time. As you make updates, how do you make these decisions, everything else. Because the coding can always get done. The coding is going to get done faster too. The reality of it is if you are using any AI tools, you see how much time you can start to save, how much more productive you can become using some of those. So I've always been this way, especially the past probably 5-6 years in a lot of the work I've been doing. Really tried to been focused heavily on some of this pre-planning stuff. But I will say that now more than ever, like you need to be spending your time doing this stuff because it's going to pay off much more. Because if I can type in a prompt that takes me maybe a minute, 2 minutes to write really carefully, and it's going to spit out, 1,000 lines of code, from some system that I can just drop into my app. Like that's what is that in total time? Half hour, maybe 20 minutes, maybe less, right? To go through all of that, check that, run that. So the act of like actually getting code, completed and shipped is no longer really the issue. It's all of the planning and everything else that goes into it. It's all of the other structure stuff. So the details are super important. I encourage you to take the time. I encourage you to plan and really focus on all these different pieces here that I truly believe are going to make a big difference in how you get stuff to production and everything else. We'll stop here. I encourage you to join the conversation through Telegram. There's a Telegram group for WuASM here. Please come check that out. Ask questions there. You can always reach out to me on Twitter, X, as well, and ask questions. Definitely go back, look through some of the other videos, see how we're putting some of these pieces together that all hopefully fit in. And I do think you'll start to see the pattern of what's going into all of this. We will have another episode this week as well, continuing our path to continuing to ship more stuff. I will also want to encourage you again, we have DevHub Live tomorrow, Thursday, that, make sure you're checking that out. We have tons of stuff coming up for the Redacted Hackathon. Again, if you have not checked it out, here I'll put the site up again. Go check out the website. Make sure you sign up for the hackathon. It's online hackathon. It's 8 weeks, $500,000 in prizes, and then if you can make it to the actual event in November, even better. But if you can't, you should at least participate in the hackathon. It's going to be a really great experience. And here at DevHub, we're going to have tons of stuff, tons of content, interviews, tutorials, all the things that you can think of, leading up to it and through the event. So plenty of stuff to help you. And we're here to help you, ship your product and, be successful in whatever you're trying to do. Until then, again, keep building, keep asking questions, keep planning, and we will see you next time. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.